Kia ora, New Zealand, and hello, world. You are listening to the Yeah Nah podcast, the official podcast of the New Zealand Skeptics. I'm Bronwyn Rideout, and with me are my regular co-hosts, Mark Honeychurch.
Hey!
And Katrina Borthwick.
Good.
So, maybe this is not a surprise to everyone, or anyone at all, but this episode has more of a holy flavor to it. The death of Pope Francis on April 21st has inspired us to look a little bit at the myths and conspiracies related to Catholicism in New Zealand and abroad. And on my part, I've certainly had more than a few laughs at what social media has come up with in terms of the memes, all about the next conclave. I think, Mark, you were saying in your introduction to the newsletter, you were having maybe not similarly humorous thoughts. You had noticed the same trends.
Yeah, definitely. I think the fact that Conclave, the movie, came out recently has really fueled a lot of this, and a lot of the memes seem to reference that. It's an interesting topic, isn't it? Part of what I lamented about in my editorial for the newsletter was the fact that this shouldn't be such an important thing. Like, this is one man, and of course it's always a man, who is the leader of over 1 billion people. All of them have an idea about the world and how it works that does not accord with reality. And these people should not have any influence over morality and ethics and how we treat people, because apart from anything else, like any other religion, it's just not good. It's not progressive. It's very regressive. I'm sure it might have been progressive 2,000 years ago, but we're at the point now where religious beliefs tend to be all about treating certain classes of people worse. And the Pope shouldn't have that kind of control over how people are treated.
A few months ago, there was an article in the New York Times about how all the new and young and up-and-coming priests, like the 30, 40-year-olds, are actually skewing a lot more conservative. So with this current conclave, and again with social media and with the news, there's a lot of talk about maybe we were going to get a more liberal pope. Now, the pope in general is not necessarily a liberal
It's
role.
a relative term, right?
Yeah, it's a very relative term. But I wonder if that's not a wish that we can actually have. I think we're actually going to start seeing a greater turn towards conservatism. Versus, say, a lot of the popes who came up in the 60s who were a lot more, yes, granted they're still popes. And of course, we also have the massive issues with child sex abuse in Catholic churches through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, ongoing, depending on where you are. But there was still more of a social justice bent to a lot of the activities of the Catholic Church, at least in certain individual churches and dioceses in the mid-19th century.
But I think when it comes to choosing a new pope, one thing the church has been doing is try to make it a lot less Italian. Let's pick from around the world. Let's show that we're a global church by picking our next pope from somewhere people don't expect. And a risk with that is in certain parts of the world, it turns out that a lot of the cardinals are very conservative. So Africa famously, most of its cardinals are conservative. So much as you might in one way doing a progressive thing by picking a black pope, the likelihood is you're going to get a pope who looks down upon gay and trans people and sex out of wedlock and divorce and has very strict views on a lot of things that these days we're just fine with as a society and we've realized aren't damaging society. They're just part of how humans live their life. So yeah, it's a weird dichotomy there that it looks progressive in one way to the church, but at the same time, I think it could be a big step backwards.
But I think we also can't underestimate that the Catholic Church is growing rapidly, more so in African and Asian countries than it is in its usual enclaves in the US and in Western countries like the UK. There's definitely a reasonable trend to bring in a pope from a region where Catholicism is booming.
Yeah, but let's pick a progressive one. And this was what I lamented about in my editorial, is like we're all here crossing our fingers hoping for someone progressive. We shouldn't honestly have to. It should be that it really doesn't matter. But yeah, who knows what they're going to pick? Thankfully, not so much as, picking a US president has an effect on the world. Obviously, we've been seeing recently that can have a major effect on things, but it still has more of an effect than I think it should.
You may not be waiting for very long, Mark, because today they announced that they're going to start the conclave next week on May 7th. And I guess before we go into some of our pieces for today, we did want to talk a little bit about some of the interesting listener feedback from Barry Lennox. He responded to my piece about EMF rocks. Mark, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I love Barry. He doesn't often write to us, but when he does, you can tell something's really annoyed him. And the idea that EMF can be absorbed by rocks, that really didn't sit well with him. Yeah, he gave us a very good, fairly simplified, but at the same time technical explanation about what EMF is and the fact that it's not a force, it's a measure of energy. He talked about what the sources are of EMF. He backed all of this up by talking about a time where he was employed to test lots of electromagnetic properties of a military helicopter. I guess there are fairly strict standards that need to be adhered to. But yeah, he ended up his article by talking about things like that. There's electric fences around farms around New Zealand which are producing a bunch of EMF. And he talked about the idea that maybe he's going to challenge them. Maybe he's going to email them and ask if they can send some rocks. And he will put them into some real world EMF tests with the equipment that he's got. And what does he say? I will measure the EMR attenuation they cause. Either it works and he'll be New Zealand's 4th Nobel Prize winner, or it does not work and I will make a complaint to the ASA, which I thought was a really nice way of ending it. I like the idea of Barry producing like a 6-page paper on his measurements and why it doesn't work as promised. I think that would be really nice. The ASA wouldn't even know what to do with it.
I worry if he did this, that they would simply put on their website that this is being tested by Barry Lennox and not mention the outcome of the testing.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Really good point. Yeah. Tested by skeptic Barry Lennox.
Yeah, or his credentials and whatever, the background, and use that as a basis to sell their damn rocks, which might not be optimal.
Look, tell Barry we will post his report on our website. We can read.
Absolutely.
Alrighty. Well, before Mark and I get heretical, Katrina is back. I think it's for your final part of your series on sovereign citizens. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think I'm over sovereign citizens.
All right. Well, take it away for one last time, Katrina.
Yeah. So in part 1, I looked at why on earth are they doing this. So if you're getting a bit confused, it may be useful to go back and listen to that one. In the second one, I looked at the justice of the peace. And in this one, I'm looking at sovereign citizen cases in the courts, mainly New Zealand courts, but there are a couple of Canadian cases which are worth mentioning. And one of those is quite famous. It's quoted in our courts a lot. So I think it's worth having a look at that one. So for this one, I did actually go in and read the texts of the actual judgments. So the primary sources there. So this is a bit like in science, you're going in and reading the research papers themselves rather than the news reports and articles. So I went in and I was just really interested to see what some of the sovereign citizens were saying in court, but also what the judges were saying about the sovereign citizens that were appearing in court. And I did manage to pull out some interesting things. So I'm basically going to go through a few cases and just share some of the observations I had. And the first one was a person called Richard Savelle, and he was actually charged with threatening to kill the former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and also sharing objectionable material. And that was actually the live stream footage of the mosque shooting in 2019. And
Civil he's not a nice man. He even has a Wikipedia page detailing how horrific he is.
Yeah. So no judgment for this yet, but he was using sovereign citizen arguments in court. So, a quote, he told the judge, "I'd rather not be tried at all, Your Honour. I've put a motion to dismiss, right of subjugation," whatever that means. And then in another hearing, he said, "No, I'm not going to plead. I require sureties, bonds and denominations." I don't even know what that means, but the judge just said, so that's deemed not guilty. It's taken as a not guilty plea. He hasn't shown up to court a couple of times, and so he's yet to be sentenced, but I'm pretty sure he will be. Another case, this is about a truck, and this is 2022, so reasonably recent. Scott William Larson is a truck driver, and he was stopped on the Remataka Hill, which is just north of Wellington, and he had already been forbidden from driving. And he had outstanding fines and a warrant for his arrest. And he wouldn't get out of the truck, and they eventually sprayed him with some pepper spray, arrested him, and then he ends up in court. So he does that usual thing where he identifies himself as a sovereign citizen, and there's this name weirdness thing. So the name all in capitals, could be like Scott William Larson would be their federal citizen name, and in this case his sovereign citizen name was Scott William. So usually there's a few non-letter symbols in there as well as lowercase letters. So in his first hearing in 2020, he did that name weirdness, and he did the usual sovereign citizen thing of accusing the judge of fraud. And as well as that, he also claimed he's part of the Ariki government and therefore not subject to the law. And I think that was an Anglican thing. I don't think it was a Māori sort of tribal thing. It's just something they've made up. And so he's saying the living Scott William was never invited to any court nor addressed by any police, and therefore the proceedings are null and void. So he's basically saying he's not himself. You've invited the corporate identity to court, but you haven't invited me, and I'm the flesh and blood person, and you need to call me Scott William. So he submits the police and district court claims are fraudulent. And that kind of went as well as you might expect. The case wasn't successful. And he tried the same tactics again at appeal in 2022. And the judge says the actions in apprehending and prosecuting him as amounting to fraud, slavery, malfeasance of public office, and deception. So the judge wasn't overly impressed by that and said the statement of claim, which is the submission made by him in court, is full of pseudo-legal mumbo-jumbo that is characteristic of the sovereign citizen school of thought. The courts have consistently held that it is an abusive process for a litigant to attempt to employ sovereign citizen concepts in seeking to avoid or defeat any state, regulatory, contract, family, or other obligations recognised by law. And then it goes on to say that this is a consistent position that the court taken when people are trying to escape the jurisdiction of court. And then he said it was an abusive process. So the same points have been made by other judges in these cases. I won't go over them all word for word, but basically they say the same thing, but they substitute the reference to mumbo-jumbo for other words exhibiting varying levels of frustration and restraint. So some of the judges let rip a little bit more than others on this.
I just looked up that government that he suggests that he's beholden to rather than the New Zealand government. They have a website that says that the government was established in New Zealand in 2030 BCE.
What?
So I'm guessing it's not just pseudo-legal, there's a bunch of pseudo-history in this as well.
My goodness. Or maybe they just don't understand what BCE means.
Maybe, yeah.
So this next one is 2023. Again, another quite recent case where someone converted a wool shed into a house without consent from the council. And his name is Richard Beresford. And so he made a submission to court and cited various things, including the Bible, Francis Bacon, Shakespeare, several legal dictionaries, the Oxford Dictionary, all sorts of weird things that you wouldn't normally cite. And what he was applying for is for the court to have the person described in his birth certificate, which is him, declared dead. And he asked the claim to be heard by the Court of Chancery, which doesn't exist. It's a court alternative in the UK that was disestablished in the late 1800s. So nothing to do with New Zealand and nothing current. So he wants to be declared dead. And the quotes from the judgment explain this a little bit more. The judge is trying to describe this and work out what's going on. And he says the claim seeks to change his birth status from living to deceased appears to me to seek that this court engage in legitimising that theory, essentially to validate the complainant's position that the law only applies to fictional legal personalities rather than natural persons.
So was he then trying to get his straw man corporate fictional version of himself declared dead?
Yeah, I think so. Trying to escape his obligations, yes. So he's doing the dual persona argument, and he's definitely trying to kill one of them. I can't work out quite which one, but he certainly doesn't want to be the one on the line for this consent fee, that's for sure. And the complainant also records that he will give up and forsake everything the commercial orders offered and given to him. Like, good on him. But quite often when these people are trying to forsake everything, it's just a lump of debt that they're trying to forsake. So there are all these weird quotes, Shakespeare, so on. And so the judge said, in my view, this claim should be struck out. I consider that the right-thinking people regard this court as exercising very poor control of its processes for it to allow the complainant's document to be treated as a proper, reasonable level of restraint there, I thought.
Yeah, we'd look like idiots if we took it seriously.
Yeah. So the next one, a person called Robin Tamihere. He is an undischarged bankrupt, and I think he's mainly been made bankrupt by the IRD, and he's seeking judgment against the commissioner of the IRD, and he had 2 applications and they were struck out. And so he replied for a judicial review of those decisions, and he demanded a number of things, including $15,000 in damages for breaching a Bill of Rights Act and a declaration that they'd been wrong, and 7 other remedies. The judge says the documents that the applicant has filed are vexatious, unintelligible, and an abuse of the court process. The meaning of the applicant's oral and written submissions are difficult to decipher. And then he goes on, he submits the application as fraudulent, so again accusing the judge of fraud, which seems to be a common soft-sit tactic, and also saying that a judge has no jurisdiction. He submits the strikeout documents have been filed by fictitious plaintiffs, so again the dual persona argument, and therefore it's defective because it hasn't called him by his proper name, basically. This is where it gets a bit interesting. The judge says, although facts pleaded are ordinarily assumed to be true in a strikeout application, that does not extend to allegations which are self-evidently speculative or false. So just break that down a bit for you. So when you're not hearing a substantive case, you're hearing preliminary things like strikeout applications or those sorts of things. Quite often the judge will assume what is claimed is to be true, and if it was true, how would I apply that so that everything possible goes through to hearing? But if a case has got no hope, even if they assumed everything was true, then that will get stopped at that point. So the judge saying that normally that's our process. But if the allegations are self-evidently speculative or false or plainly unsupportable without foundation, then that creates a problem. As I said in one of his other judgments, Salmon versus Slater, the courts will not provide a boat for a deep-sea fishing expedition without bait. I suggest to the applicant that he would benefit from consulting a lawyer if contemplating further legal proceedings.
So his legal efforts are just fishing, basically. They're just trying to catch something, but without even bait. I guess that's the real insult.
Yeah, it is. So, unsurprisingly, Judge Palmer rejected Tamihere's pseudo-legal arguments, dismissed his case, and awarded costs against them. And of course, this can happen if you lose a case that you take him. The costs follow that, and you could get stung for quite a lot of money just in the costs. So it's not like, even if you self-represent, you've got no legal costs yourself. And I imagine there's a number of sovereign citizens that self-represent. They can still get stung with a whole lump of costs because of that. Although I suspect this guy's bankrupt, so it's not going to be paying anything in a hurry. Another one, it's about vaccination. So this is COVID-19. Tahi Ricks wasn't able to do the final year of study towards a Bachelor of Architecture, and this was at the Art Institute of Canterbury, and they had a COVID-19 vaccination policy, and Mr. Ricks wasn't vaccinated and he didn't have an exemption, so he wasn't able to finish studying towards his architecture degree and finish it. So He got annoyed with that and he sent ARA, the Institute, a document which was headed Affidavit of Truth. So an Affidavit of Truth is the title of a document that's quite often used by sovereign citizens, and it usually has assertions in it that are basically threats. That document required ARA to dispute claims, statements, assertions, facts contained herein, which he said was his truth. And then it listed 82 matters for them to respond to. And then if they didn't dispute those, then there would be an automatic default judgment against ARA. And they would be liable for Mr. Rick's fee schedule. So he put together a fee schedule for all of these matters. And he had calculated a total fee that ARA would have to pay him of more than $10 million. That includes $3 million harm to his education and $7 million for his future.
Wow, it sounds like he's rounded up quite a bit with that one.
Yeah, I mean, a few extra
Definitely.
zeros. So ARA didn't respond. I don't know why. Perhaps they were a little confused or didn't take it seriously, perhaps. So he sent them another document, and that document said, look, you failed to rebut my affidavit of truth, so it now stands as truth in law and a judgment in commerce which no one can overturn. He gave ARA generously a further 10 working days to arrange a meeting with him to discuss the settlement figure and discuss payment options for this $10 million. Otherwise, he would start debt collection. He said, you didn't respond, therefore I'm taking that as agreement that you pay my fee schedule. But that argument didn't fly, so in terms of non-response being acceptance, that argument was deemed not valid in court. And in fact, his letters backfired in a big way. He was trying to say that there was a contract between him and the university somehow that they needed to provide this education to him. But the problem is his own statement of claim, and he pleaded that he said, I sent a notice of conditional acceptance, which is not an outright acceptance. So, for example, if you accept a job offer on the condition that the pay is that's not an unconditional acceptance. If you buy a house, but you make that conditional on a builder's report, that's not unconditional, that's not a binding contract until the condition is met. And he again talked about conditionally accepted and agreed to the policy under duress. And if there's any doubt about his position, he stated quite clearly when he returned ARA's letter on 16th of February with the words, no consent, no contract. So there was just no contract. Like, by his own words, he was saying there wasn't a contract. And here he is trying to enforce the contract for damages for $10 million. So that didn't work. The various parts of the case were all dismissed and out.
This guy's young, right? He's university age. Like, most of the Sov Sits seem to be fairly old, like in their 40s and 50s, and they've amassed a bunch of debt and whatever else. But this kid, did you say he was like 22?
I don't know his age. Possible
Okay.
he wasn't young. I don't know. I didn't even think of the age thing.
But I assume he is. I wonder whether maybe he's just spent too much time on the internet and found some sovereign citizen forum somewhere that he just got too deep into, because this seems really weird from someone young.
He wasn't doing the vaccination, so I know there is a bit of a link to some of the anti-vax stuff, and which one came first, I don't know. But next one, 2022 case again. James Jones argued against having to register his dog. Now, the cost of registering a dog is $50. Now, the reason he didn't want to register his dog or think that he needed to at all was because the dog was a legal person, and a person does not have to register with a local authority or wear a collar or be restrained by a leash. This dog's a person.
So he's gone through all this pseudo-legal nonsense to prove that his dog is a person and he doesn't need to pay the $50.
Yes.
Presumably even at minimum wage, 2.5 hours, and you've eaten through $50 worth of your time. Presumably it cost him more in his time than it was worth to even do this.
Yeah, that's some avocado on toast, at least in terms of time. So I don't know. So on 27th of June 2020, he published a document entitled Public Proclamation, and this was in the local Wanganui newspaper, and it said, "Take notice, all affected and interested parties. I, James, the sovereign man, have created a new person. A Vizsla dog, date of birth 1 December 2019, being the private property of James and is known as Connor, is by this public proclamation declared a person and subject to all the privileges and protection of a person." There's a bit more, and then it goes on, "and a estoppel is hereby created against any affected or interested party who does not respond within 10 days from the first appearance of this public proclamation to the electronic address." I'm going to read his bloody email address. I'm going to do it. jim@jamessonofjames.com, and cannot subsequently claim colour of right or protection of law. So that sounds very official, doesn't it? So his dog's a person, because he said so.
I feel for his family. So for anybody that's interested in this one, he runs a website, jamessonofjames.com.
Yes.
And like I'm on there at the moment, and there's one page about the private property of James where he lists his private property, which includes his wife. The woman Oksana is the common law wife of James and is the exclusive property of James, he says on his website.
Has he declared his wife a person, or is she just...
Yeah. Is a dog more of a person than his wife who is property?
Yeah, I do worry about some of these people. Okay. So yeah, to avoid $50. But anyway, case dismissed. Costs were awarded against him. So, that's going to be thousands. So
Much more than the $50 that he was
Yeah, I
due for
think so.
registering a dog. Yeah.
for some of these ones, when you have multiple cases, it's not like on TV, you don't have a whole courtroom to yourself. They might have about 6 cases going at once. So the judge is sitting in the front there, and there'll be long tables, and each sort of lawyer and person will be sitting at those, and they'll be hearing one, and then they'll dismiss it, and then the judge will move to the next table. And that does happen in New Zealand. It's possible these were just moving at speed as well. I don't know. So yeah, if you're thinking of a big, long, dramatic case, with these ones that are just getting dismissed, it may not be the case. So, Diederik Meankin, I hope I've said that correctly, another undischarged bankrupt, he sought to use the family court to transfer his estate, by which he means his legal personality, to the Crown in order to avoid his legal obligations. So he is trying to move his debt to the Crown, which is very nice of him. He'd been trying to do this for 7 years, since 2010. He was first made bankrupt in 2012 after trying to not pay tax in 2003, 2004. He was again made bankrupt in 2016. Now, sometimes the state can take over assets if someone's not deemed competent, in terms of they're not able to look after themselves or make decisions. But he was deemed competent, despite what you're about to hear. Due to his bankruptcies, he had an official assignee who had his property right, and they actually were against him taking this to court. So the official assignee is basically just, it's a bit like a liquidator in a way, just for a private person. They don't do the same level of work, but they're trying to make sure that things aren't worsened and things get paid if they can be. So he'd previously filed 5 applications with the family court and 2 in the High Court, and the reference to family court leads me to believe he may not have been paying child support through IRD. So, nice guy. And the judge said this type of argument is an abusive tactic adopted by litigants seeking to avoid their legal obligations. Seems fair. Claim was struck out. But not only that, the judge banned him from taking any of these kind of actions, engaging in this double split person concept, or seeking to transfer his estate to the Crown for 3 years. I'm surprised it wasn't longer, actually. Yeah, another person trying to move their liabilities back to the public.
to all of us, right? Trying to
Yeah, I
spread the
know.
load amongst all of us taxpayers.
Yeah, I think people think there's this big government entity out there, and it's no, they're completely funded by all the money we pay. So if there's some idiot out there taking needless cases to court, that's costing all of us money. There are quite a few cases where people are trying to get out of prison using sovereign citizen arguments. There's so many, I couldn't go through them all. And they do this via habeas corpus application, which is basically habeas corpus is a safeguard against unlawful detention. So a prisoner can go in and say, I've been unlawfully detained and I'm asking the court to rule that my imprisonment is illegal and that I should be released. And a lot of them go into this whole dual persona identity, as in you've got the wrong person, you need this corporate person, this identity, you need to put them in prison, not me, the real flesh and blood person. And so there's a few cases, 2022, and they're all against the chief executive of the Department of Corrections, because that's where all the habeas corpus applications go. And you get the usual affidavit of identity or something like this, where they're talking about letters being capitalised and all of that carry on. And they might talk about things like the overt or covert agents of the state. I'm not who they say I am, that sort of stuff. The judge in the He case said that this demonstrates the prison's belief in their dual persona, the use of the legal terms that are irrelevant to criminal law jurisdiction or simply nonsensical. The assertion that they can only be held subject to the law or to liability if they have personally agreed, and it challenges the jurisdiction of the state. So basically, the argument's being put forward as you can't hold me to the law unless I agree to that. It's not a great way to enforce the law at all in a country.
Yeah, if we could all opt out whenever we wanted, things would not go well.
Yeah, so the courts do have the power to deal with all actions that may amount to criminal offences in New Zealand. Nobody can disassociate themselves from their legal persona and remove themselves from the jurisdiction of the courts, and that's what the judge said. And the arguments advanced are untenable without legal foundation. A lot of the cases in terms of the habeas corpus, they all talk about this dual persona, and the judge's comments are generally just say this is legally unsound. There's one where they use a Maori sovereignty argument, and that was rejected on the same basis that it was unsound. There was one person, Robin Martin, in 2016. He described himself as a freeman of the land, not subject to any act of parliament. And the judge basically said there's no merit. And I'll quote, incomprehensible statements about birthright and being a natural person not susceptible to the laws of the country are regularly and properly rejected by the court. Numerous examples, but they get a bit samey after a while. I'm not going to go all through them. The Canadian judgments, particularly one that sits behind them all, is quite interesting. That is called Meads versus Meads 2012 from the Court of the Queen's Bench of Alberta in Canada. And this is basically the reference point works. When judges make judgments, sometimes they'll quote judgments from other Commonwealth countries. That tends to be more the higher courts that do that. This judgment runs for 159 pages plus appendices, and it contains 736 number points. And it's a very thorough analysis of subset pseudo-law, and it was done by Chief Justice J.D. Rook. I don't know if he normally does this or he just had a bit of an axe to grind, because essentially this was a divorce matter and the husband was using subset arguments, which are called OPCA in the judgment, organised pseudo-legal commercial arguments to claim immunity from the court authority. So this is just a divorce matter, a case that came over someone using subset arguments, and his response is huge. He's basically written a book. He did the usual dual persona thing, and the judge made some useful comments. But the really interesting thing about this is it starts to say that there are these sovereign citizen gurus out there, and that it's basically a scam. So he's saying they've proven to be disruptive and inflict unnecessary expenses on other parties and ultimately are harmful to the person in superior court and intent to invoke the strategies. So even the people that are using these strategies are getting harmed by them, and they're basically doing it to make money. And so he says sites and must be stopped. That's what the judge says.
I think that's an interesting part of it, is the fact that a lot of the people that are inducing and enticing other people into using these sovereign citizen arguments, they're not doing it themselves. They realize that they'd get in trouble, so they are getting other people to do it rather than them. And certainly the first time I ever heard about sovereign citizens many years ago was in the context of a cruise. And basically you'd pay thousands of dollars to go on it, and every day you could hear talks from experts who would tell you about the American legal system and the tax system and how you dodge all of this. And from memory, none of those people who were teaching others how to do it themselves were doing this. They were just filling people with bad advice, charging them thousands of dollars for it in their own scam, and then letting them loose on a poor, unwary government who suddenly had to deal with a bunch of people who thought they knew the law better than anybody else and were suddenly claiming that they didn't have to pay taxes, etc., etc. So, yeah, there is this class of people who are out there just getting other people to do the dirty work for them.
That's what he says. He says these are commercial product design promoted and sold by a community of individuals. These are the judge's words, whom I refer to as gurus. Gurus claim that their techniques provide easy rewards, like not having to pay tax, child support, and all of that. There are allegedly secret but accessible bank accounts that contain nearly unlimited funds. But if you know the trick to unlock the gates, you can transform a bill into a check with a stamp and some coloured writing. And, you're only subject to criminal sanction if you agree. And it goes on. And these secrets can be yours for small payment to the guru. That's what the judge says. And then he goes on. And these claims are, of course, pseudo-legal nonsense. The bluntly idiotic substance of Mr. Mead's argument explains the unnecessarily complicated manner in which it was presented. OPCA arguments are never sold to their customers as simple ideas, but instead are Byzantine schemes which more closely resemble the plot of a dark fantasy novel than anything else. Latin maxims and powerful-sounding language are often ornamented with many strange markings and seals. Litigants engage in peculiar ritual-like in-court conduct. Medieval alchemy is a helpful analogue. Like, oh my goodness, the judge said that. He was angry. Mr. Meads, there's no basis in law to demand $100 million per use of his name.
Of course.
Yeah, and so I think the gurus as scammers is a really interesting angle on that whole thing, and I think it's true. So he was going, maybe it's not entirely the fault of the substance in court that are being done, but behind them there's a whole bunch of people just basically using them and taking advantage and making money out of it.
And of course, in America, they have the protection of free speech, which is so often a thing that, like, free speech is seen more as sacrosanct in the States than a lot of places, to the extent that people who are telling others obviously false information that will be detrimental to their health, they're given a free pass. And I guess it's the same thing with this pseudo-legal stuff. It's free speech trumps everything else. So yes, it's wrong. Yes, it's provably wrong. But we can't stop people from telling others that this would work and this one little trick will allow you to never pay taxes again in your life.
Yeah. Okay, the final judgment is quite fun. So this is another Canadian case. It's R versus Duncan, 2013, Justice James O'Donnell. And he takes a narrative approach, and this is an oral judgment, but I don't know if he was just saying all this and someone's writing it down, or they write down oral judgments, or I don't know. But I can't read the whole judgment, but it is quite amusing. And so I'm just going to let people go and find that and read that if they want. R versus Duncan, 2013, Canadian court. And you can go and read the full story if you want.
This has been a pretty exhaustive and thoroughly investigated series for you, Katrina. Tell the audience, has there been some stones left unturned here?
I think I could go and do an analysis of the legal errors, but I just don't think I can be bothered. I don't think the judges really went that far down that track either. This particular last case, the justice thought they were going to have to analyse this in detail, and then they found the Meads versus Meads. So part of the decision is going, oh, thank goodness I found this other case I can quote, and now I don't need to actually do all the work. I'm going to take that same approach, and I don't think I need to go and look at those. I'm not a lawyer. And I think there are some interesting stories behind people that were involved in some of these cases, like some of the things Mark brought up. So there's a bit of that, but I think I need a break from sovereign citizens now. I'm up to my eyeballs and dual personas and imaginary people.
Yeah, I think you deserve a break after all of this. It must have consumed you for a while.
It wasn't too bad.
Alrighty, so to just cap off the episode, Mark and I are just going to share some of our articles about Catholicism in New Zealand and abroad. I guess I'll go first because I thought I was going to be writing lots about Michael Baigent. For people who don't know, he was one of 3 co-authors of a very controversial but very famous book written in the 80s called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. And one way or another, even though the courts semi-disagree, it was the inspiration or the predecessor to the Da Vinci Code. Now, how that's relevant to New Zealand is that Michael Baigent was born in Nelson, then went to Christchurch, to the University of Canterbury. He's Kiwi, and he co-wrote this very interesting Catholic conspiracy that was completely based on a fraud.
So he's responsible for Dan Brown then. He's who we have to blame.
Him and Richard Lee and Henry Lincoln, his 2 co-authors, a documentarian actor and another American fiction writer. We can blame the 2 of them. But there was a Frenchman who was starting to create this hoax back in the 50s or 60s. And him and the French guy Plantard and his co-conspirators had put all these documents and hid them in libraries all across France. So that when Lincoln and Lee and Baigent were doing their searches, they came across them and they thought it was real.
Right.
And even Plantard eventually came out not long after this book was released and said, this is garbage. It's all fake. Nonetheless, the story of Jesus and Mary having sex, having children, and those children intermarrying into the noble families of southern France persists, and making $1 million along the way for the various people who write about them. So I thought I was going to be writing more about that. However, I also got caught up into the story a lot more because I thought it was a little bit more skeptically relevant of Mary Aubert. Mother Mary Joseph Aubert, also known as Suzanne Aubert for our international listeners, was born in France, and she came over as a Catholic missionary mid to late 1800s. But her reputation in New Zealand is a bit mixed, a bit of a controversial figure. She's really well known for 2 things. One, her name and face and visage were part of the branding for a well-known product line in New Zealand in the late 1800s, line of herbal remedies that apparently she had a farm out in Jerusalem, which is a community out in Wanganui Way, and just growing and producing these herbal medical products. But the legend that is built around her is that she is one of New Zealand's first green fairies, as in they were claiming that she was actually growing cannabis or hemp and using that as part of her herbal treatments that she was offering. I've read a lot of uncited claims that she was specifically using it and serving it to the other nuns who were living with her at this mission in Wanganui and using that to help them with their menstrual cramps. Could not find the original source of that.
It's a fun story, though.
Oh,
Getting
absolutely
a
fun.
bunch of nuns stoned.
Yeah. Now, when you look at the original ads from 1890 to the early 1910s, they do say, oh, this is completely herbal. She lived amongst the Maori. And it's kind of left at that. And there's all these little testimonials for people saying, oh, you cured my cough. And oh, you cured this, you cured that. Things never change. The more when you read these old ads, it feels like the same sort of woo and testimonials that we read today about a lot of herbal and pseudoscientific treatments. The issue at hand is that, of course, if you look at the other advertisements for dentists or other apothecaries of the time, They were definitely selling like cannabis cigarettes. They were selling cocaine. They were offering those things as pain relief or anesthesia for dental treatments. Very common, not at all like an unusual thing. But there's a lot of controversy here for Mary Aubert because A, she's a nun. So you have the Catholic Church saying, no, there's no evidence in her archive. There's no evidence whatsoever that Mother Mary Aubert was actually
A drug
growing
dealer?
or, yeah, I wouldn't say he's a drug dealer. She wouldn't have been a drug dealer. This would have been a very normal set of treatments.
Giving
So
it
just
away
saying-
for free.
Yeah.
Oh, because she was
Yeah,
giving away.
like it's part of it was part of medical. It's how we always like to joke about coke. We used to have cocaine. Things were different back in those days. However, the reason why the claim of Mary Aubert being the first little green fairy is important is that she's actually, or she was up until 2022, in line for canonization. She was on the road to be New Zealand's first saint. It's something that's been on the cards for her since soon after she died, allegedly. She had spent some time in Rome around World War I. She wasn't able to come back to New Zealand, and allegedly she gained a reputation for her charity and the work that she did with the sick and the wounded and working through a couple of famines. So she impressed maybe the right people. And so this case for canonization has been ongoing, but it really picked up speed around the 2000s. And she got up to pretty far through the process, but things kind of stopped in 2022 when the Vatican Medical Council determined that the miracle that the New Zealand campaign was trying to attribute to Mary Aubert had a medical cause. It wasn't a miracle. It had a reasonable medical explanation, which is an interesting decision to come about.
Yeah, apart from anything else, the bar that the Catholic Church has for medical miracles is very low, like lower than, let's say, your average doctor would put that bar.
We don't have too many details about the case that was put forward as a miracle, but it was published in a North and South magazine that there was a woman at the ICU in Wellington Hospital. The doctors were basically telling her family, hey, look, this is going to be a palliative care issue. Let's move her to palliative care. And the family went to the church, and the church went and prayed to Mother Aubert for intercession, and the woman recovered. So this was seen to be the miracle. But the Catholic Church disagrees. So it's just a very interesting story, just trying to pull apart, okay, in terms of the timeline, it would not have been surprising for Aubert to use cannabis. It was standard. But at the same time, the Catholic Church is saying there is no evidence, but they're not necessarily providing evidence. And their counter-arguments, they referred to a toxicologist who was writing in 1971 about, oh, New Zealanders didn't really know about marijuana or cannabis. It wasn't that widespread. And it's like, actually, and I was able to pull up from papers past a lot of adverts saying, oh, yeah, come to such and such dentist for cannabis. Or this apothecary is selling like cannabis sativa cigarettes. So in the fullness of time, I was able to do more thorough research and say a toxicologist in 1970 who does not have access to scanned records from the 1890s.
Mm-hmm.
And then it came to the question of, okay, let's talk about Mary Aubert's recipe. Apparently, she never recorded her recipes. She kept everything very tightly in her head. But there's potential that we may be able to find out what was actually in her formulations. It's a long shot. She did sell her formulation to two different pharmaceutical distributors. One was the New Zealand Drug Company, Prosser and Company, and the other one was Charlin and Company. So potentially in their archives, there might be something. Or maybe they just had something and they just slapped her label on it and all she really did was sell her visage, because she did have a point where she, for months and months and months, put out this public advertisement campaign saying, yep, I was very unhappy with the formulation and people were saying that it was of lower quality that my distributor put out, so I've canceled my contract and taken control of everything.
Well,
so there's something that's happened.
Yeah.
So, but as I said, if I can find these archives, and there's a good chance, I know certainly with the New Zealand Drug Company, parts of their archive are held at the archives in Wellington, so might get a chance to have a look. There may be nothing, there may be something.
I mean, we've got cannabis, medical cannabis use now. Like, it obviously does benefit some people in some situations.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's not a inherently bad thing. It's just whether it is a solution to your medical problem or something.
I mean, but for me, that wasn't the question with the story. It was like, okay, here's this claim about Mary Aubert being this person, and what is the evidence? And we're not necessarily getting a conclusive set of evidence that she was this green fairy.
Right.
And also, it's interesting to see what that means in terms of her allegedly Maori mentors. There was a Maori sister named Piata, or Sister Piata, and this was somebody who allegedly taught Mary Aubert a lot about Maori herbal treatments. But again, that's someone else who also doesn't really come out until a little bit later, if I recall my archival search. And it was just a brief one because no one ever actually mentioned this sister at all in the records while Mary Aubert was alive. So I don't know if maybe she's a later creation, or maybe just, again, no one was aware about how extensive Piata's involvement was in Aubert's herbal remedy pharmaceutical operation was. Or maybe simple racism, maybe no one wanted to know. That was something that had to be hidden, that there was a Maori herbalist who was at the helm of it all, or who was very informative. There's a few gaps there. So kind of found the records, at least for my searching for what I had at the time, a little bit disappointing in that regard. So it's inspired me to actually try to think about doing a little bit more research on this subject.
I'm just really tickled by the idea that New Zealand came somewhat close to its first Catholic saint being someone who was slinging weed. I think that's very appropriate for this country, given the nation's love for the drug. And let's hope that somehow the New Zealand branch of the Catholic Church manages to push this through.
They're not going to let her be pushed through as New Zealand's first sainted green fairy, that's for sure. She's not going to be the saint of 420, no matter how hard Cosmic Corner may want to try.
Yeah, they don't have to officially write that down anywhere, but everybody in New Zealand will know. We will make sure that they all know this bit of history.
And then, Mark, you also did a little bit about Soul Core and the 5 Catholic myths, so why don't you tell our audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the first one was an article I'd written a few months ago, and it was a spare article, a filler, that if ever I had a week where I was sick or something like that, I had something ready to go. And it was about Soulcore, which I'm not going to go into too deeply. You guys can all look it up for yourselves if you're really interested. But the thing I found was Soulcore is basically yoga for Catholics. And there are certain issues that a lot of Catholics seem to have with yoga. Religion is part of it, but also the tight-fitting outfit. Yoga pants are really not in for a lot of Catholics. They're a little bit too showy. So, yeah, it looks like basically a couple of people in the States have put together this thing called Soulcore. And to me, as a total amateur who's never even done yoga, it just looks like yoga. But there's no mention of yoga anywhere on their website beyond a little bit in the frequently asked questions where they deny that it's yoga. And I don't know, as I say in my article, what I think would have worked a lot better is if these people had come out with something that was just taking out the religious aspects and maybe the tight-fitting clothing of yoga and then rebranding it like that. And then everybody else could use it and it would be good. Like us non-religious people would be like, oh, brilliant. Here's yoga without any kind of pseudo-scientific mumbo-jumbo. But what they did was they just stuffed as much Catholicism into Soulcore as they possibly can. It is, go and watch it on YouTube. It's painful to watch, like someone doing the Stations of the Cross while they're doing yoga poses, or someone doing Hail Marys, lots of very olden style ritual that's then just thrown in together with yoga poses, along with rosary beads. So they have like ropes with large beads on them that are like the rosary, and then they'll have a single very, very large rosary bead, which is used instead of a weight for the weight practice. So they've just replaced everything with just totally overdoing it. And when you watch the videos, and it's basically all women that I've seen in the videos, these women are just reciting lots and lots of text over and over again. I guess it's the Catholic way. It's just really weird to see it stuffed in with yoga. On Reddit, when I went to look for a little bit more, the one side was the Catholics who were basically saying, is this too much like yoga? Is this far enough away? Can we be okay? And the other group, the non-Catholics, saying, hang on a minute, isn't this just cultural appropriation? Aren't you just stealing someone else's stuff and then just relabeling it as something that's yours, where you've actually just nicked it all? And I think I had more sympathy for the second one, but the whole thing is just hilarious. So yeah, that was my little throwaway article, and it tickled me. I thought it was fun. Did you guys watch any of the videos?
Yeah.
I think I saw them a few years ago.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm late to the party with this one then. So the other one I wrote about was, well, it was going to be a book review. It was going to be a really weird book review that I was going to write 25 years after I read the book. Because the other day, Hamish on our committee, who we've had on the podcast before, he posted a picture in our committee chat of the front cover of a book called In God's Name by David Yallop. And I'd read this book a quarter of a century ago while traveling somewhere in Southeast Asia. And the thesis of the book is that Pope John Paul I was probably poisoned. He was killed because he was too much of a do-gooder, and the church at the time had its fingers in a lot of pies and was dirty in a lot of ways and financially was doing a lot of crooked stuff. And he was about to blow the lid on all of this. And so some of the cardinals got together and basically through the Freemasons managed to poison him in his bed. It's an interesting enough book. It looks like it's not true. It looks like here's me joining some dots together and oh look, it's a picture of a unicorn. But it's interesting as I guess there were a bunch of books like that that came out around the same time. Conspiracy had like a golden age, I think, back then. But what it made me realize as I started looking into it and looking into other people's opinions, I started noticing that mentions of this tended to be on pages that talked about Catholic conspiracies. And this is not conspiracies the Catholics are making up, but conspiracies about the Catholics. And this was like the idea that cardinals would murder a pope. This was one of the least weird that I was finding. And so I picked 5 really good ones. The first one of the 5 that I picked wasn't that interesting, but it was the idea that ever since 1958, all the popes have been false popes. And I think this is one I heard about years ago. There's a little bit of a memory in my mind that I have heard this, but the idea is that there was a Cardinal Siri who won the papal election. He won at the conclave, but then they gave the job to somebody else. And then apparently 5 years later, when that pope died, same thing happened again. Apparently for a second time in a row, everybody voted for Siri and Siri lost. And I'm sorry for anybody that has an Apple device and I'm setting Siri off by saying his name. And then beyond that, I think there were another 2 elections in the same year. Pope John Paul I, there's an idea that basically he was passed over for that one. And then because John Paul I died like a month into office, then they had another conclave and there was a 4th pope and Siri again lost. I looked into it briefly. There's talk about how he was forced into a vow of silence and moved to a monastery in the middle of nowhere. Doesn't look like it happened. It looked like he carried on working for the church. Looks like he approved of all 4 popes that he's supposed to have lost to due to cheating, so he doesn't seem to have made any fuss about this if it did happen. So all in all, it looks like nonsense. The second one, Jesuits, who are the Society of Jesus. They're like a group within the Catholic Church, about 500 years old. Apparently they sank the Titanic. Now this one was a little bit daft. So the idea with this one was that the Jesuits were this evil group who they're warmongering and they wanted to start the First World War, I think because they were investing in armaments. And so there was more money to be made by creating a war. But there were 3 bankers, 3 financial businessmen, very senior, who were all against the formation of the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve was the vehicle that the Jesuits were going to use in order to get the First World War started so that they could maximize their profits. And so apparently the Jesuits commissioned a company to make the Titanic, and then they somehow managed to make sure that all 3 of these businessmen got tickets onto the Titanic, and then they deliberately ran it through an ice field at night at top speed. Also, the captain was a Jesuit, and he was ordered to do this. And it's like, how implausible is it that you can line all of these things up together? So I looked into it, and sure enough, those 3 businessmen, John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, they did all die on the Titanic. But of course, this whole story was made up after the event. So whatever 3 businessmen were on the Titanic, I assume, or 5 businessmen, people would have picked them for this conspiracy theory. The Titanic was going at nearly full speed when it went through the ice field. So that is a second thing that's true. But when I looked into things like As far as I can tell, the captain was not a Jesuit. Captain Smith, I don't know what religion he was. It didn't say on his Wikipedia page, but I did find other articles saying he was not a Jesuit. And as far as these three businessmen saying that they did not want the Fed created, two of them I could find nothing. One of them I found a single article from the New York Times where he was arguing for the formation of the Federal Reserve. So he was not against it, but obviously as skeptics we don't need to spend too much time on it because we can see on the face of it it's a little bit ridiculous. The third one is the chronovisor, and this one, there's a lot of these kinds of stories where most people will read them and instantly go, obviously that's nonsense. But there's a subset of people on the internet that just devour these stories and love them. And the chronovisor is a supposed machine that you can use to look back to any time in history and see full color video of any event. Now, you don't get sound, you just get picture. And supposedly, the Vatican has one of these machines somewhere hidden away. And there was a Benedictine monk called Pellegrino Anetti, who back in the 1960s came out publicly saying that he'd been allowed to use this device that the Catholic Church had, and he'd used it to go and see the crucifixion of Jesus and the Last Supper and several other seminal events. I don't know if these things did happen. How did he know the right date? Did he have to scan through lots of locations? To me, even finding when these things happened, if they did happen, would have been months of work just scanning through footage to find it. But he did this and he had evidence. The evidence he had was a picture of Jesus that I guess this chronovisor must have been like a Polaroid camera or something where you could get a printout, and he had a close-up picture of Jesus. It didn't take long for a journalist to figure out that he just made a copy of a postcard that you could buy in a nearby town, and he just flipped it horizontally. He'd made a mirror image of this and then claimed that this was a picture that he'd taken with this device. So that one bit of evidence he had, at least that, it's very obvious that that's fake. And again, the rest of the story, like, it's not going to be true. Like, just thinking about the physics of a device like that, and how the hell would it even work?
It sounds like an episode of Black Mirror or something. You put a little round device on the side of your head, because they always have round devices, and it goes whir, and then by the grace of God, you find the scene you want in history. But you can imagine if they had a machine like that, you would know about it because it would cause so much havoc, like the impact of something like that.
Yeah, and there's a story by, I think it's Isaac Asimov, with the idea that a machine like this is invented, and they're talking about what does it mean to be able to look back in history, but the end of the short story is, hang on, can't you look just half a second back? So you can actually see anywhere in the world what's happening right now. So any state secrets, anything that's going on, you can remote view anything in real time. So it's not just the historical stuff, it's the very recently historical stuff that you can look at. Yeah, like the Catholic Church, I think they're rich enough, but they'd be a lot richer if they had a device that let them do that.
This is Catholic vision of remote viewing.
But at least it's a device. At least it's not just in someone's head, which is what you'd expect to be a Catholic thing.
Oh, yes.
They actually have a scientific device that do it. But yeah, the Catholics are not telling anybody they've got it, but somebody on the internet has decided this.
Oh, yes. So that's been verified by an outside source then.
Yeah. The next one, and this one did tickle me, was that the Vatican has the world's largest collection of pornography. I spent a little while looking into this. I found some not totally trustworthy sources. I did find a web page that someone, it looks like they'd spent a while looking into this, and they'd referenced a book where they said they thought that was the original source of the claim. So I went and downloaded a copy of the book. It was called An Unhurried View of Erotica from 1958. And the quote in that book says, "The whereabouts of the world's remaining great collections of erotica, although unknown to the public at large, is of course no great secret to bibliographers and librarians. The world's foremost collection reposes in the Library of the Vatican in Rome. It includes 25,000 volumes and some 100,000 prints, collected over the centuries from all parts of the world as specimen outcroppings of the creative urge that are to be shunned by good Catholics." Now, I was finding articles even up to last year that were just blindly quoting this, that the Vatican has the largest collection of pornography, but from the people that have been allowed to look at these collections, Certainly, the Catholic Church have been fairly open, digitizing some of these things, or lithographing, I think, back in the day. And the people that have been in and seen this, they have not seen any major pornography collections at all. I think, incidentally, there are certain works of major art that happen to have something that could be described as pornographic in. So, Da Vinci drawing naked women. They have stuff like that, but that's basically as far as it goes.
I've heard also a similar rumor about one of the major evangelical Pentecostal fundamentalist universities in the US that has one of the largest collections of porn, allegedly.
Okay, it makes for a fun story, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I think it's just that, did you know who has the largest collection of naked ladies? And it's funny because I got a poster from the Auckland Art Gallery a couple of years ago by Guerrilla Girls, like a art collective, and says, do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art section are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. And those were the stats from 1989.
Nice. So the biggest collections I could find that appeared to be verified are the Kinsey Institute. Kinsey obviously famously spent a lot of time studying sex and norms and what people actually do versus what the public thought that people were doing in their own bedrooms. So they do have a large collection. And I believe the French National Library has a collection that I think is called Hell. So it was made a long time ago, and I guess back then it was seen as a bad thing. And it sounds like they've kept it up to today, and now it's probably less seen as an evil thing, a temptation, and more just as a curiosity. So that's the fourth one. The last one, and this brings us right the way up to modern times, was that the Catholic Church created COVID. And there's a documentary that I've not gone through the pain of watching yet, but I will do. But it's a weird guy in the US called Stu Peters, who in 2022 collaborated making a documentary with a chiropractor and acupuncturist called Brian Ardis. And most of these ideas about the Catholic Church creating COVID seem to come from this chiropractor. And basically, the idea is that it was a synthesized snake venom that was being put in the water supply, and that's what was making everybody sick. So globally, someone, the Catholic Church, it turns out, had managed to infiltrate water supplies around the world and was giving us snake venom. And the reason was because the snake is of the devil.
How homeopathic this whole dang story is.
Either that or they were just dumping a whole lot of this snake venom in. I don't know. But the idea was that it was going to merge with our DNA and make us hybrids of Satan. And this is, I guess, the evangelical view that the Catholic Church is evil, that it is the Antichrist, that, it's foretold in Revelation. But yeah, the whole thing is it's just ridiculous. And the little things they had as proof were things like that for coronavirus, if you look up virus, it means venom. And then if you look up corona, one of the many uses of the word corona is the gold ribbon at the base of the mitre that the Pope wears. So the big hat that the Pope wears, there's a gold ribbon at the bottom of it, and apparently that's known as the corona, which is just crown, right? But this is proof that, like all good conspiracy theorists, the Catholic Church left hints when they were doing it. Just enough hints that these people in their basements could put it together. And yeah, this one's just sad. Like the other ones I found funny. This one just feels like hatred. It just feels like fear of the unknown and demonizing a group that's not your group. And it's modern and it's American and it's crass. And I really didn't enjoy that one.
So they were referring to the serpent that tempted Eve to eat the apple in the Garden of Eden, presumably.
Yeah, and that's how they get the DNA from that serpent into you, is through COVID.
Awesome.
But then they mentioned mRNA. So they mixed getting the virus with getting the vaccine because they were somewhat confused with the whole thing. So then it was, the mRNA is what puts the snake DNA into your DNA.
So there's two ways you can get it. The Catholics with their demon DNA have infiltrated both the COVID and the vaccine. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, I think they were just very confused.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Let's
do
not
you
try to
just
make sense of
pray
it. This is not going to be fruitful. I don't know. As I said, I've not watched the video. They might have an antidote. Presumably, if they did have an antidote, they're going to sell it to you, right?
Yeah,
As with a lot of these scammers, there's going to be a money angle at their end, I would presume. But one day in the next month, I will probably put myself through the pain of watching that video.
The selling video, right?
Oh, it's available for free on Rumble. I don't know whether it's a legitimate copy, but someone's uploaded it to Rumble.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't want to give them any money.
I do look forward to the review, though.
I'm really curious as to how they resolve these scientific inexactitudes.
I think my review is going to be one sentence and half it's going to be swear words.
Is it, I want my 1 hour back, or however long it is.
All right. Now, before we get into Membership Corner, just to know, Johnny Grady is still working very hard on conference planning, and you'll be hearing more about that in the next couple of months. But I just thought that now was time to ask for our members of the New Zealand Skeptics to keep their ears and their eyes open for any potential nominees for our Media Bravo or any real contenders for the Skeptic of the Year and the Bent Spoon. The committee really wants to hear from our membership about who they think has done some really great skeptical work this year and who has done an utterly atrocious job and deserves a mountain full of shame. If you have the nominee, you can simply email us, forward us the article, or email us a name at committee@skeptics.nz. And so we're going to do our usual capping off of the episode with our Membership Corner. The next Skeptics in Cyberspace will be May 21st. The link will be in the show notes, as well as on our Facebook page and the various meetup sites that we have. In Wellington, we have our in-person Skeptical Activism in the Pub on Thursday, May 8th. Mark, do you want to give your spiel?
Yeah, it's the same as it always has been. Well, no, it's not, because it's got a new name. But apart from the new name, it's the same meeting. So please come along, come and make a complaint, and help us with a little bit of activism and cleaning up at least a little bit of the nonsense that we find every day in New Zealand.
And then still in Wellington, we will have our usual in-person Skeptics in the Pub, and that'll be held on May 16th at the Intercontinental Hotel on 2 Grey Street. We will be inside the hotel, in their hotel lounge. Always a great time with great drinks, great food, great company. The next in-person meeting of the Auckland Skeptics in the Pub will be on Tuesday, May 6th, and that'll be at the Dice and Fork starting at 6:30 p.m. And Dunedin Skeptics in the Pub continues to be on hiatus, so we will keep you posted as soon as they have their next meeting. Aside from listening to the podcast on several fine podcast platforms that you can access almost everywhere, we are now on YouTube. So go and visit www.youtube.com/@skepticsnz and add us to your playlist. There's tons of other videos that you can watch from conferences past, including great talks by Susan Gerbic, Mark Edwards, the amazing James Randi, Richard Saunders, and Steve Novella, just to name a few. So you have lots of things to watch while you wait for our next episode and for our back catalog to be uploaded. Any comments, questions, concerns, or kudos, please email us at either podcast@skeptics.nz or newsletter@skeptics.nz. That's it for the Yeah Nah podcast for this fortnight. We hope you enjoyed the episode. And that's going to be kakite and goodbye from us until next time. Bye for now.
Bye.
Yeah.